Good evening, everyone. We'll get started in just a few minutes. A few housekeeping notes to keep in mind before we begin. Please note that this meeting will be recorded. A video of this session will be available on the YouTube page for Yale's Council on East Asian Studies after the event. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Doing Chinese History in a New Era. This is the second of a series of 3 webinars organized by myself, Denise Ho, and Emily Baum at UC Irvine. This is aimed at graduate students and other researchers who are facing unprecedented challenges in conducting research and pursuing their professional development. This webinar is generously sponsored by the Council on East Asian Studies at Yale University and the Long U.S.-China Institute at UC Irvine. The topic for tonight's session is careers beyond the academy. One of the topics that has come up among faculty recently has been the concern for the job market for current students, especially those who are about to graduate. While in recent years, the historical profession has begun to address alt-ac or academy-adjacent careers, we recognize that we are in uncharted territory. Still, we offer this webinar in the spirit of thinking about professional development beyond the academy, and we hope that the experiences shared this evening will be helpful not only to historians of China, but to graduate students in the humanities and social sciences more broadly. And I think of the 350 people who registered for this event, we really have a broad range of disciplines and interests. We're very pleased to introduce and include 3 panelists with us tonight, each of whom will speak for approximately 10 to 12 minutes. At the end of the session, we'll open to Q&A. And again, if you have questions, please use the Q&A function at any point during the webinar, and a couple of us will be monitoring the Q&A. Our first speaker, I'm pleased to introduce, is Maura Cunningham. Maura received her PhD in history from UC Irvine in 2014 and worked at the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. She is now the digital media manager for the Association for Asian Studies. She is the co-author of the 3rd edition of China in the 21st Century, What Everyone Needs to Know, and her book, Wandering Lives, A Story of Art and Politics in 20th Century China is forthcoming. Thank you so much, Maura.
Okay, thanks so much, Denise and Emily, for inviting me to participate in this session. It's really great that we are able to connect virtually via this technology, as much as I would love to visit Irvine or New Haven again. So from the start, I'd like to say that I might be a little bit unusual among a lot of people speaking about alt-ac careers, because being a writer and working outside the classroom was really never a plan B for me. It was always my intended path. When I entered graduate school in the fall of 2008, I had specifically chosen to go to UCI because the history department there had something of a record of people going on to do non-tenure track work after they graduated. So I never felt like I was fighting there to make my career ambitions heard or accepted. And I've spoken to a lot of different groups of scholars about this topic. And I frequently hear students say that they're uncertain about talking to their faculty advisors about the possibility of alternative careers. I think that conversation is going to change quite a lot based on current events and the pandemic and the job market moving forward. But I have to say that wasn't really my experience. So I'd be very interested in talking to students about how to negotiate or how they negotiate that in the current climate. So when I entered graduate school, from the very beginning, my advisor let me know that before anything else, I still had to meet all of the benchmarks and standards for the PhD. So even though I knew that I wanted to do something different with my career, for the next 6 years, I was still going to have to write papers, present at conferences, apply for grants, write a dissertation, and so forth. But in addition to that, I also looked for any opportunities I could find to steer my graduate career in the direction that I wanted it to go, which was writing, editing, talking to broad audiences. So I was kind of living a dual track life, graduate student by day and freelance writer by night. I worked initially, when shortly after arriving at UCI, I started working on a group blog called The China Beat that 3 people in the history department had started. So I was writing for it. By my 2nd year, I was editing it. I did a lot of freelance writing, often with my advisor, who really helped my career along by inviting me to co-author things. And then that opened the door for me to write for different publications solo. So I was able to build my portfolio with his assistance. I did, as a 2nd-year graduate student, do a TA-ship, which really confirmed what I had entered graduate school knowing, which was that I didn't want to spend my career in the classroom. I enjoyed teaching, but it really took a lot out of me. And it wasn't my primary passion. That's what I've realized over and over again. So during my 3rd year, I was able to work as an editorial assistant for the Journal of Asian Studies, which gave me more editing experience. It taught me how an academic journal operated. And then later, I was able to work as the managing editor for another journal. So I was building a CV that really focused on writing and editing different kinds of publications, because I had a pretty good sense that that's where I wanted to direct my career after I finished my PhD. And in my 4th year, I went on leave. So I had been, as I said, sort of living a dual life, and I put the academic side of things to the side a little bit. And I went on leave. I took a fellowship at the Asia Society in New York, and I was part of the team that launched the China File website there. So that was building on my experience at the China Beat and on the freelance writing that I had done, and working on a much bigger platform. And that also helped me develop a lot of the technological skills that I still use in my current job. So I had that time away from really intensive academic life, but I hadn't left my graduate career behind. And so I did my year at the Asia Society, then I went to Shanghai, and again, worked this dual parallel career track. So I researched and wrote my dissertation while I was there, but I also continued doing a lot of freelance writing on the side. I taught courses for a study abroad program, which was, again, teaching, but in a very different kind of environment. And I did a lot of public speaking for general audiences. So I was finishing my PhD in the summer and fall of 2014, and people kept asking me what I was going to do next, now that I was finally finished with graduate school. But I didn't really have much of an answer for them. So I had this vague plan of staying in Shanghai for the indefinite future. I thought I could continue teaching, I could continue writing, I could work on a book. I did think about applying for postdoc positions, because that would give me some sort of protected time to do research and writing and work on a book project. But one thing that I hadn't really anticipated until I started talking about postdocs with my graduate professors was I had been very public throughout graduate school in talking about alternative careers and writing posts for different blogs about my career path. And because I had been so public, a lot of my professors warned me that I probably would not be successful in postdoc applications, because universities generally regard those as a bridge from graduate school to an academic career. And so since I had very openly said that that wasn't my goal, they would probably prefer postdoc candidates who would follow a more traditional path. So I had all these different ideas after I finished my PhD. None of them really completely formed. So I was drifting around a little bit, and then I got approached by the National Committee on US-China Relations, which is a non-governmental organization in New York. It runs programs designed to increase understanding between people of the United States and China, which is something we very, very much need at the current moment. So I was approached by them. One of my previous classmates from a master's program had been working there. He was leaving his position. He thought I would possibly be interested in moving into his old job. And I interviewed with him. I received an offer. I moved from Shanghai to New York to work there. And my primary duty was to run the Public Intellectuals Program, which is a 2-year non-residential fellowship that helps mid-career academics develop the skills to speak with audiences outside academia and to make connections in the media and policy worlds. So this was really pulling out a lot of the different threads that I had been following throughout my graduate career. You know, talking about writing for different audiences, addressing different audiences, and so forth. And I think at the National Committee, they thought I was a good person for the job because I had been carrying out that parallel career throughout graduate school. I did know both worlds. I, you know, had spent the past really 10 years when you with graduate programs in academia, but I also had a lot of connections outside of it. And I understood the challenges, but also the benefits of engaging in non-academic pursuits. So I was not at all divorced from academia, but working for a non-governmental organization was really hard. I was working a lot of long hours. I was traveling a lot. I never developed or maintained any momentum in my own research and writing. So that parallel track that I had been following throughout graduate school, I thought I could keep it up, but it turns out that that wasn't really possible. And I tried all sorts of things, like saying, I'll get up at 4:30 every morning and I'll write for an hour before I head to work, or things like that. And I would do that for a week and I would be really committed to a routine, but then I would have to go on a trip somewhere, or I would oversleep one day and my routine would get derailed, and then I would get thrown off course and I wouldn't be able to build up that momentum again. And so I was really struggling with the feeling that I had gone to graduate school. I'd spent a lot of time there to improve my research and writing skills and to build my career as a writer, but I wasn't using that education for the purpose that I had intended, even though I really enjoyed my job. And after about a year and a half or so, I decided that working at an NGO like the National Committee just wasn't the best fit for me. And so I started looking around for another position that would offer me more of that balance and sort of enable me to return to that parallel track or dual track career that I had enjoyed so much when I was in graduate school. And so I wound up at the Association for Asian Studies, which is in Ann Arbor, Michigan. They created this position of digital media manager, which is mostly working in social media and digital publications, running our blog. Now we have a webinar series. And so again, I'm building on the skills that I had developed in graduate school. I'm still working with a lot of academics, but also working on my own research and writing whenever I can. And I've been at the AAS for about 4 years. Actually, it will be exactly 4 years on Saturday. I really enjoy the work there. We've obviously faced a lot of new challenges because things that we have traditionally done, like our big annual conference, we were not able to hold this year. So we're trying to find new ways of connecting with our members and engaging with our members. And I think that is, again, really building on all of the skills that I developed when I was in graduate school and just putting them to a different use and engaging with new technologies, learning new platforms. So that is not something I necessarily anticipated when I started graduate school. I was still thinking of a career in writing and editing in fairly traditional terms. But one of the things that has really been a hallmark of the last 5 years of my life or so is increasingly working in technology and digital realms, which is not what I had anticipated doing, but I discovered that I really enjoyed it. So I think with that, I will stop. I'm absolutely happy to answer any questions, but I don't want to take up more of my time. So if you have any questions for me, just pop them in the Q&A and I'll be happy to address them later.
Great. Thank you so much, Maura. I already see that we have some questions about what specific skills that you can address in the Q&A time. I'm pleased to introduce our second speaker, Evan Dawley. Evan received his PhD in history from Harvard University. Evan worked for the State Department's Office of the Historian before returning to academia and is now Associate Professor of History at Goucher College. He is the author of Becoming Taiwanese: Ethnogenesis in a Colonial City, 1880s to the 1950s. Thanks so much for joining us, Evan.
Hi, thanks. Sorry, my connection was a little unstable there, but I now seem to be live, yes. So first, thank you very much, both Denise and Emily, for organizing these sessions and for inviting me to be a part of them. I'm very glad to be here and getting a chance to talk to, as I look at the participants list, the largest audience probably I've ever spoken to. I also want to thank my Maura and Alex, the co-panelists. Hopefully here we'll be able to all say things that will be of use to those who have tuned in this evening. So, right, as Denise said, I'm currently Associate Professor of History at Goucher College, but I did have this 6 or 7 year period where I was working at the US State Department. And so mostly what I'm going to talk about is that track, the non-academic portion of my career. But if I don't go on too long about that, at the end, I will say a few things about how I was able to transition from the non-academic track back into academia, or I can answer that in Q&A. We'll see how that goes. So in contrast to Maura, my original plan was definitely to become a professor. But it's kind of a long story, so I've got to go back a ways, and I will tell it as quickly as I possibly can. When I graduated from Oberlin College as an undergraduate, my plan was to go and teach English in China for a year or two, and then to return to the United States and to do a PhD in history and become a professor. That was the plan. So I did step one of that. I graduated and I went off and I taught English in Kunming for a year. And at the end of that experience, I no longer knew that I wanted to be a professor. I knew that I still wanted to work with China, but I was no longer convinced that I wanted to be in the classroom, that I wanted to teach. And that is sort of the trajectory that I'd had in mind, like going on to teach at a place oddly like Oberlin. So I sort of hit a holding pattern for a little while, and then decided that what I wanted to do was work in the field of international education as it related to China. And so I did a master's degree in East Asian Studies, and that led me to a really great job working for an organization called World Teach, running English teaching programs in China. But it was in the course of that job that I realized, no, I actually do want to be a professor. I do want to follow that trajectory, follow that path. And so at that point, I applied for PhD programs, was fortunate to get in, and then went on and began the PhD. So finally, after several years of wandering around a bit, I was back where I had been as an undergraduate, and I was following that road to become a professor. Well, that's not where I ended up immediately. So as I neared the end of my time as a graduate student, I found myself really not excited about my dissertation. Maybe some of you who are watching this will find can sympathize. I was not engaged in a healthy relationship with my dissertation. And so at that moment, I was again not sure that an academic career was the right thing for me. And it just so happened that the first time I went on the market with this mindset of not being sure that I wanted to continue as an academic, I saw a job ad that was put out by the Office of the Historian at the US State Department looking for someone with expertise in Chinese history to work on a couple of projects on US-China relations that they had lined up. And I knew about the Office of the Historian. I had worked with documents from the Foreign Relations of the United States series. This is a series of US foreign relations documents that the Office of the Historian compiles and publishes and has been doing so for 160 years now. So I knew about the office. I actually knew somebody, one of my, or somebody who I shared an advisor or a committee member with, but who was a few years ahead of me. I had met him a couple of times and he worked at the office and had good things to say about it. So it was a known quantity somewhat. And when I saw the ad, I really could think of no reason not to apply for that job. And so I did. I applied for it. I wasn't that enthusiastic about doing a postdoc at that point because, again, I wasn't excited about my research at that moment. there was a certain geographic appeal to the office of the historian, right? I could be in DC rather than potentially ending up in a place I was less excited to live. So I applied. I also did the academic search, right? I applied for a lot of academic jobs. That was actually a pretty good year. There were 20 some jobs that I applied for. I don't know that I've seen that many since then. Yeah, it was a pretty good year. But as I went through the process, the State Department job was the only offer that I received. And so I took it. Also because it had a lot of appeal in its own right. So that appeal was that I was going to be researching the history of US-China relations. I was going to be working in an office with a lot of other PhD historians, 30 or so, I think, at that point. So it really struck me as though it would be an academic setting without the pressure to publish or perish if I wanted to stay in that job, and with nights and weekends free. So I would be doing historical work, but I would actually have a life outside of that. And that was very appealing at that moment. So off I went to DC to work at the historian's office. And I mean, I really was using a lot of the skills that I had been trained in, right? I was working as a professional historian. I was doing research in primary materials. I spent a fair amount of time searching through the US National Archives, through various sources of the Library of Congress on US foreign relations and relations with China. So I was continuing to do that sort of research. I did occasionally get to do a little bit of research in Chinese sources as well. I actually, for one project that I ended up working on a little bit later down the road in my career at the historian's office, I went and looked at Qing Dynasty gazetteers on out of Taiwan from the 1880s and 1890s. Actually, that's how I met Toby Meyer Fong, who I think is on the next round of this panel, or this series, sorry. I met her at the Library of Congress one day as I was looking through Taiwan gazetteers. Anyway, so that I should also say that for the people in the office who are working on the Foreign Relations of the United States series, they do all archival research. They go out to the National Archives, to presidential libraries, to other agencies, and they search through primary documents, and they collate and they compile. So it really is doing the work of a historian. I did a lot of historiographical reading for the projects that I was working on. Yeah, actually quite a lot of reading of historiography. And so it really, in many ways, from the research side, was very much like being a historian. There was also a fair amount of analytical writing. Not academic writing, but at least assembling sources, using them through analysis to create an argument or to create an explanation of how historical processes unfolded. The sort of best example that I have of that type of work was a program that a colleague and I developed. It was really her idea, I joined on, called the Historical Briefing Program, where we developed a set of historical briefings on either US relations with particular countries or on the historical background to particular policy issues. And so, in fact, some of the most rewarding work that I did for the whole time that I was at the State Department was looking into the historical origins of things like the South China Sea dispute and the East China Sea disputes, and ended up getting to give a number of briefings on that and write a few short papers that I delivered to people within the State Department, and also actually at the Congressional Research Service. So that was analytical historical work. It was really quite interesting to do. I also, in the context of my job there, had the opportunity to do a bit of teaching. One of the first projects that I got involved with after I started there was developing a course in the history of US diplomatic history that became a part of the training for all new Foreign Service officers. that actually hadn't been a part of Foreign Service officer training until about 12 years ago now. So I was part of the development of this. I was more of an organizer because my expertise was not in the history of US foreign relations, and most of the people who worked in the office were experts on that. But I helped to sort of design these modules and to shape the way in which the modules developed. And these sort of evolved over time into a pretty tight history of the State Department, coupled with a few case studies about US diplomatic history to sort of help Foreign Service officers in training learn about the institution and the practices of that institution. And it really actually, the side benefit of that diplomatic history training was that it opened doors for other sorts of engagement with the Foreign Service Institute to train diplomats in the histories of particular regions or the histories of particular issues. This job also gave me the opportunity to do some adjunct teaching at schools in the DC area, George Washington, Georgetown, in particular, when they had need for a China course or a course on Taiwan history, which is my specialty. Somebody would go on leave, or they would get a grant to do a particular course, and so I was able to be an adjunct without it having to be sort of my primary source of income. I did perhaps contribute to the adjunctification of the academy, but there was a need for a fill-in from time to time, and I was able to do that, which was good for me, and ultimately I think good for the institution and the students. So I was able to be a professional historian. As I maybe wrap up here, if I were to pass along any advice to those of you who are wondering about alt-ac careers, it would be first to be flexible. This is perhaps an obvious point, but there are simply not enough academic jobs, so many of you, some of you at least, will be doing other things. And I will put in a plug for the federal government a little bit, because it does employ a tremendous number of PhDs, including a lot of history PhDs, all across the branches of the government. Anyone with an interest in military history, the military branches all employ a lot of historians. Some historians anyway, in the Forestry Service, and in other branches as well, Treasury, right? So it is actually a really plausible career path. I noticed that somebody asked a question about think tanks. I don't know specific numbers on how many PhD historians go into think tanks, but it's a great pathway to go down. I know that think tanks definitely like to hire historians because of all the skills that we have. Another bit of advice is to ask yourself, what sort of balance do you want, right? Do you want to spend your whole life teaching and researching and writing, or do you want to be able to have a little bit more flexibility in your schedule and the things that you do? And then finally, don't lock yourself into a mindset where you can only do one thing. Again, be flexible, and don't worry about wasting your graduate training, because there are a lot of ways in which you can use that graduate training, as Maura has pointed out, and as Alex is going to talk about next. It's useful in a lot of ways, and I will just leave things there and let Alex get his day. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that, Evan. I'm pleased to introduce our third speaker, Alexander Akin. Alexander earned his PhD in East Asian Languages and Civilizations from Harvard University and taught at Boston's Roxbury Latin School and Brandeis University. He is currently a co-owner of Bolerium Books in San Francisco and serves as a consultant for media, government, and coin collectors. He continues to publish and present in his field of research, and his forthcoming book is East Asian Cartographic Print Culture, the Late Ming Publishing Boom and Trans-Regional Connections. Welcome, Alex.
Thanks, and thank you for organizing this. I was at Harvard at the same time as Evan, And like him, I expected to become a professor when I graduated. And the fact that I graduated during the last big recession played a big role in the fact that I ended up sort of turning a hobby into my job. So I have a lot of sympathy for the people who are out there now in this environment getting their PhDs. So how did I go from being someone who studies books to someone who buys and sells them? I think you could pinpoint the tangent at one particular very strange incident. I was walking to campus from my apartment, and it was recycling day. There were stacks of newspapers and bins and stuff like that. And as I was walking down the sidewalk, I saw among the newspapers this piece of very colorful cloth in one of them. And the first thing that pops into my mind is, why is someone putting cloth into the recycling bin? This is, so I pulled it out, and it turned out to be a very unusual book. It was a book of poems by a French woman living in Saigon in around 1950. And she had gone around taking photos of herself in front of various different monuments in Vietnam and writing poems to accompany them, thanking the French soldiers who helped to keep Vietnam French. And only 50 copies had been published. God knows how it ended up in someone's recycling bin. But since I was on my way to campus, I carried it under my arm. I did a little research on OCLC and saw there were only like 1 or 2 holdings in the world. So I walked up to the rare book room and I gave it to them, and I said, hey, this, you should have this. They gave me a little certificate and all that. So later I was talking to some friends about it, and one of them said, Alex, are you nuts? There are colonial history buffs who would pay through the nose for stuff like that. And somehow it had never occurred to me, but that sort of tweaked something in my imagination. And I started going around with a little wagon on recycling day. And in the vicinity of the Harvard campus, it's amazing what kinds of things people threw away. And so, I would find things and I would take them to get trade credit or to sell at McIntyre and Moore or places like that, get academic books. So it was strictly a hobby, when I was procrastinating, preparing for my generals or something like that. But it was fun. Now in 2008, I was set to graduate, but the job market didn't look optimal. So I decided to delay for a year. By this time, we'd moved to San Francisco because my wife had a great opportunity here. So I was basically done writing my dissertation, but I wasn't going to graduate for another year. So a lot of days I put my baby daughter in the baby carrier and just go around to various different bookstores. And I absolutely fell in love with one of them called Bolerium Books, specializing in radical political history, LGBT studies, the international labor movement, and so on. And it got to the point where I was spending so much money there, I asked them, is there some way I could do something around the shop in exchange for store credit? So that's how it first got linked to Bolerium. And it's funny, when I first started, like on one of the first days, they had me working in this room full of all these boxes of books, papers. Some of it had been there for years. And I opened the lid of one, and it turns out to be a box completely full of Chinese language gay travel guides from Taiwan, from the very beginning of when they were starting to do that sort of thing. So I took them upstairs and showed them to the owner, and he had no idea. He didn't know they were there. He had no idea where they'd come from, but he knew a librarian at Yale who would probably want them. So he picked up the phone, made a phone call, and that afternoon they were on their way with an invoice. So that was my first inkling that, there weren't going to be any Ming Dynasty maps in these boxes, but the skills that I had could somehow be applicable to other sorts of materials. The next year, in 2009, the job market turned out to be even worse. This was the Great Recession, right? I got my degree. I was on the market for a couple of years. I got a couple of very short-term sort of positions where I was replacing someone or whatever, and there was no hope of long-term employment from them. And that's when the realization came that given the successful career that my significant other was building here in San Francisco, how much sense did it make to do this trekking across the country in hopes of finding a tenure track job, when there was something I loved doing right here in the city, and it offered a lot more flexibility schedule-wise and so on. And so I decided to stick with the book business. In the years since then, I've become a full member of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America, which is the most prestigious booksellers organization, as the members will tell you. I'm the vice president of the Northern California chapter now. And oddly enough, I'm the only member of the ABAA who reads Chinese. And this has opened all kinds of opportunities. When local libraries like Stanford or UC Berkeley need appraisals of collections that people are donating, if there's Chinese language material in there, I'll often get a phone call. When other book dealers have Chinese language materials, they might ask me to help identify them. And in exchange, I get the chance to have sort of first crack at some awesome items. I brought an example here. There was a couple of foreigners, last name probably Gilligan, who visited the capital of Manchukuo in the early 30s. And on behalf of the mayor's office, they were given this set of propaganda photos highlighting the various ethnicities of the area, the building projects that were going on with the Japanese-backed government. It's just a really neat set, and I just ended up with it because some guy knew that I could read Chinese, and he asked me for help, and I made him an offer. I brought a few other things to show sort of how my training is relevant in this field. Every rare bookseller has their own sort of way of doing things. I wasn't starting from scratch. I moved into a shop that already had a well-established reputation in things like radical politics. So I sort of was able to expand that in new directions because of my Chinese background. This is a newsletter from a Cantonese group in San Francisco, which was suppressed by the FBI in the 50s. Almost all of its members destroyed anything they had that could be incriminating because there was a point where they were deporting people left and right. But there were two guys, Him-Mark Lai and Jackson Chan, who saved their troves of these, and both of them were donated to UC Berkeley, but there were a lot of duplicates. And when the pandemic is over, I'm hoping to be able to place some of these in other research institutions. Last year, I gave a talk on this group at the Book Club of California, and that's how the people involved with the Jackson Chan estate learned about me. So I do try to keep active in terms of giving talks, writing academic things. I wrote a book, more of a booklet, a few years back about the sort of subgenre of Chinese children's books featuring Khmer Rouge guerrillas as heroes. Sort of an odd interest of mine. When Chinese laborers were brought to Cuba in the 1860s, this is some of the paperwork that was involved, and we managed to get a trove of these, which is now at Stanford. Another interest of mine that is especially relevant nowadays is the history of African Americans in China and post-revolutionary China's support for the American civil rights movement and Black Power movements. The first American to do a concert in China after the revolution was Aubrey Pankey, who's almost forgotten nowadays. He ended up moving to East Germany, but this is a program for a concert he did in Shanghai. I've managed to find some ephemera from those, which are placed at various universities now. Here's an example of another children's book about a boy whose father is killed by the KKK, and he has to scramble to survive on the mean streets of capitalist and racist America. And as a historian, I'm always looking at things that are fodder for future historians. So my bookstore is always on the lookout for things like zines put out by the Hong Kong Democracy Movement, or this, which is the last thing I'll show. Gay and lesbian activists in the mainland have had some ups and downs in recent years. There are periods when things relatively open up, and then stuff that was put online might get taken down later. So there's a group in Hong Kong that takes these online blogs and other resources and prints them in book form, so that if they're censored or taken down later, you have the hard copy. And I just love being able to put these into the hands of libraries, students, researchers, and collectors. So I think that for the sake of allowing some time for questions, I'll just wrap up there. But that's the path I've taken. And there are, there were other sorts of opportunities that people discussed with me. If I had been interested in video games, there's a surprising number of jobs related to video games in China and so on. But maybe in the Q&A, we can talk about some of that stuff. Anyway, I'll wrap up here.
Thank you so much, Alex, for sharing your experience with us and also sharing all of the amazing artifacts. I'm mindful of time and see we have about 20 minutes left in this session. And so what I've done with a Q&A is to sort the questions into maybe one quick practical question and then one more experiential question for each speaker. Actually, while we're here, can I invite all of the speakers to turn their videos back on so we can all be together as a panel? Great. So let me ask, let's see if we can try to get through one round and see if we have any time for anything additional. For a question for Maura, a technical one, what kinds of technical skills were required in the job that you do? And then the more experiential question, how easy is it to transition in and out of journalism? For Evan, the practical questions, the quick answer, where federal government jobs posted, and could you publish while you were an employee of the State Department? And then maybe you could also talk about the question of how flexible the transition was in and out of academia, since you did something sequential. And then finally, for Alex, we had a question about whether you think that the name of the PhD granting institution mattered in your various jobs that you've looked for. Do you think that was the prestige of the institution was a factor? And then if you have time for the broader question, how has U.S.-China relations, tensions in U.S.-China relations affected your work? Shall we start with Maura?
Sure. So in terms of technology and figuring out what tools you need to know, even before I started a PhD program, I was just always really online. Going back to college, I guess is the best way to put it. So I was kind of always hearing about new platforms and social media channels and things like that. Certainly the basics are Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Those are sort of the core of social media for an organization like the AAS, which is a big, scholarly society. I learned how to work with different website builders. So back in the day, there was Blogspot. By the time I was in graduate school, a lot of places were moving to WordPress, which is really where I gained the majority of my experience, and also Drupal, which is a slightly different platform. So I think understanding different channels of communication, kind of just keeping an eye out there and knowing what people are using. I subscribe to a lot of different technology newsletters so that I'm kind of always hearing about new things coming along. Because of the constantly evolving nature of technology, it's really hard to, figure out exactly what you need to specialize in. And so I think it's really advantageous to be very broadly versed. I can say certainly, 5 years ago, I wasn't using Zoom, and now it's a constant part of my daily life. So we're always seeing new advances, new platforms. And it's just really important, I think, to keep your eyes and ears open so that you're aware of what's coming down the pike and what what platforms, what tools are the best ones to work with the different kinds of audiences that you're interested in. And that can change from industry to industry. Again, I'm kind of talking very broadly about, you know, if you're interested in writing, editing, and or working for a nonprofit organization, sort of website, social media is going to be a really nice start. So also need to address the experiment, the broader question at this time, or should we move on?
If you wouldn't mind giving a quick answer, I think it would be helpful.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I just don't want to take up too much time. Journalism. So moving in and out of journalism. Like academia, also a tough career these days, lots of uncertainty. Again, I think it's important to make as many connections as possible and to kind of be aware of what's going on in the field. So as I said, I subscribe to a lot of technology newsletters. I also subscribe to a lot of newsletters about journalism, so that I'm always up to date on, you know, different fellowship programs, who's hiring, who's looking for people. Not because I'm looking for a job, but because I know a lot of people who are, and so I like to be able to share that information. So I think journalism, like academia, it's having those sorts of personal relationships and knowing people, being just kind of constantly being in touch with them, so that if you're on the job market, then if they hear about something that sounds interesting, they can come to you and say, hey, I've heard about this great opportunity. So I think that's really important work that you can do while you're still in graduate school, is kind of broadening your network, so that when you are in a position to look for a job, you can start reaching out to people who you've made contacts with.
Thanks so much.
So my turn, is that?
Yes.
Okay, so very quickly on the where federal government jobs posted, it's usajobs.gov, and I'm right now putting that into the chat. Hopefully everyone can now see that. Everything is there. And you can set up filters to search for particular types of jobs in particular agencies and things like that. So then the next question was right about publishing research while I was at the State Department. So the only restriction, I guess there were two restrictions. One, I couldn't publish on anything that was classified. And I did occasionally read documents that were still classified. And so obviously I couldn't publish on any of that. And more generally, I wasn't allowed to publish on projects that I did for the office, specifically for the office or specifically for a request within the State Department. But I was allowed, but beyond that, I could publish as much as I wanted on pretty much anything I wanted. Everything just had to go out with the standard disclaimer that you know, all of the ideas, views expressed in this piece are the views of the author and not of the U.S. Department of State. I actually had to say that every time I gave a presentation at AAS or any other conference while I was at the State Department. Those were the first words out of my mouth. But with that disclaimer, it was actually pretty open to publish on pretty much any topic. Yeah, pretty much any topic. So the other part of the question was about my transition out of that job. So, right, clearly I'm no longer there. I decided to leave the State Department at a certain point. Let me just very quickly say a couple of words about my reasons for wanting to leave, and then very quickly about how I managed to achieve that. So it took me a while to really settle into the job, by which I mean it took me a while to get a portfolio of responsibilities that were really satisfying and meaningful to me. And so that took 4 or 5 of the 6 or 7 years that I was there to really become fully satisfied with the job. And so the whole time I was continuing to apply for academic jobs. And it became sort of an annual ritual that I would say, this is the last year, and then the next spring or the next fall I would reapply. I'm sure I drove my advisor crazy. He was very good about it. So yeah, I wasn't fully satisfied until the end. And then the other reason was that I did decide at some point I wanted to take the dissertation and write the book out of it. And I just knew that I didn't have time to do that while I was working a 9-to-5 job. It just wasn't really going to happen. So that was the other reason that pushed me back into academia. As to how I actually managed to do it, well, a combination of two factors. One, sitting down, having sort of the wherewithal 1 year to sit down and whip the dissertation into something that I could submit, so that when I applied for jobs that fall, I could put into my letters without lying that I had a book manuscript under consideration. And that actually got me interviews that I had not previously gotten in the year or two before that. So that was one factor. The other, luck, unquestionably. I was actually, I was told the 4th candidate in the job that I now have. And candidates 1 through 3 got other jobs. So they had to go with me. And that's it.
Alex?
Hi there. So the question about the prestige of the institution is interesting. So I certainly expected it to be the case. I'm the son of a steel worker. You know, there was a period in my youth when we were on food stamps, and I thought, you know, I've made it to Harvard. I've crested something that no one can ever take back or whatever. Long story short, obviously I didn't get an academic job. Some of the jobs I most wanted, the people who were successful at them came from public universities, especially University of California. I think that there are some schools that are really looking for someone more from a public university background. But the whole decision process sometimes seems so arbitrary. Every committee is idiosyncratic. Sometimes you hear stories later on about the discussions that transpired, and you're like, this is no way to hire faculty. But anyway, it is what it is. And people out there have my sympathy, whatever their situation may be in that regard. Someone asked about whether tensions between the US and China have affected the business. I do import stuff from China, only things that are legal to import. They keep changing the year before which you're no longer allowed to export stuff. Who knows, maybe soon it'll be 1976 or something like that. But for the time being, I'm still able to bring out post-revolutionary material. Before it's sent out, it has to be looked at by censors. I have a contact in Shanghai who packs stuff for me and all that. But there was one very strange incident where there were some things published in Esperanto in China. China is one of the few countries that had quite a large, actually, Esperanto publishing industry. Shijieyu, it's sort of, you know, the utopian international language, and so it fit in very well with the socialist ideal. But the censors apparently looked at the Esperanto stuff and they thought maybe it was foreign publications or something. They just tore them all up into pieces and packed them back in the box, sealed it up, and mailed it to me. So I don't know whether that was because of tensions or just a very strange person working at customs or something like that. But so far, in terms of being able to ship things to China and stuff like that, it hasn't been affected yet. Of course, you know, I showed a couple of things published by Hong Kong activists, and the bookstores where I bought those in Hong Kong, I don't think are going to be around much longer. But yeah, time will tell. Time will tell.
Thank you so much to our panelists. There has been A couple of questions about archives and libraries. So for those, I would refer you to our first webinar, which is recorded on YouTube, and then our subsequent webinar, which is forthcoming in 3 weeks. If we have time for one last question, a couple of people have asked about jobs that are available for non-US citizens. And I'm mindful that everyone on the panel is I believe a US citizen, so they may not have experience, but perhaps you've heard. Would any of you have anything to offer on alt-ac jobs for non-US citizens?
I'll just say quickly with the federal government, so the job that I had is not open to non-US citizens. You have to be a US citizen for that sort of work. But there are other jobs, I'm pretty certain, more language-based, less history-based, that are open to non-US citizens. US diplomatic posts around the world have large teams of what they call foreign service nationals, who are non-US citizens, who are local residents. But that's not exactly, I don't think, what this audience is looking for.
I think other channels that might be available are librarianships. I think if you go to your university librarian for East Asian studies, chances are they will have graduate degrees in Chinese or East Asian history. Publishing houses are also a possibility. One of the people that we tried to invite to join was not a US citizen and is working for a publishing house, a university press. So I think there are opportunities out there, but they may not be as obvious as the US government ones. Maybe if there's one final question for Maura, someone asked about MA, for people who have an MA in East Asian Studies, is there a good resource for looking for organizations that would hire someone with such a background?
I think that really depends so much on what area a person is interested in. So certainly, you know, a non-governmental organization like the National Committee on US-China Relations or a lot of think tanks, they hire quite a lot of research assistants. Almost all of those organizations have internships, if that is the kind of work that someone's interested in. So I think for a lot of them, that's kind of the ideal position for someone who has an MA and maybe they want to build some work experience, or they're thinking about potentially going on to a PhD, but they're not quite sure yet. You'll frequently be tasked with research and writing. So, you know, probably scouring foreign language news sites and writing up summary reports, or compiling different documents, helping to do research for white papers, things like that. So if sort of policy making and national security, US-China relations, if those are topics that interest you, I think think tanks and other non-governmental organizations would really be the first place to look. Also, of course, there's organizations like Human Rights Watch, which again is a think tank and policymaking organization, but with a very different angle. So that is one area, one path that people with an MA could go down. If you're interested in journalism, that's another path. So quite a lot of this is really dependent on what particular sector of the field a student is interested in. But I do think there are quite a lot of opportunities out there to do those sorts of jobs. Many of the ones that I've been in contact, many of the people I've been in contact with have gone the sort of DC and New York route, but that's just the area that I work in. So those are the people who I know best. I don't know if other panelists have more to contribute to that.
Also, there are foundations like the Asia Society or Asia Foundation, which also have offices on the West Coast, so it's not just New York, DC, but places like that also, that would certainly, organizations like that are interested in people with backgrounds in East Asian studies. And I began my career in international education with a master's in East Asian studies, because I had language and knowledge of China. And so that was able to sort of pave that way. PhDs were not necessary for that.
So thank you so much. We're just about out of time, so I want to take the opportunity to thank our wonderful panelists and the Council for East Asian Studies for providing all the staffing and support for our event, and all of you who have participated. I thought it might be something to end with, that I heard something very useful about mentoring in the last year, that there are two kinds of mentoring. One is to give advice, and one is to share experience. And I think that we've heard three very rich paths of experience, and I hope that if you were listening, as you were listening, you found something that rang true for you. So thank you once again, and a quick reminder that our third and final webinar will be Wednesday, August 19th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern, and the topic is thinking outside the archive. So I think that responds to one or two of the questions that came up in the chat. Please note that you do have to re-register to receive the link for that webinar. So thanks for tuning in, and see you all again in 3 weeks.